The wind howled through the canyon as Jack Hollis rode across the ridge, searching for lost cattle. Then he saw it freshly turned earth near the riverbank, too small for a grave, too deliberate for an animal. He dismounted, brushed the dirt away, and froze. A hand small, trembling, reached up from beneath the soil. Moments later, he pulled out a young Comanche woman, barely breathing, clutching a silent baby to her chest. "Please," she gasped. "Save him." Jack wrapped them both in his coat, heart pounding. Whoever buried them hadn't meant for them to live. And as he carried them toward his ranch, he knew he wasn't just fighting death, he was fighting fate itself, and the hatred that ruled the frontier. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The cabin walls groaned beneath the weight of the wind, their seams leaking drafts that carried the sting of snow and the smell of ash. Jack Hollis knelt beside the hearth, his rough hands trembling as he stoked the fire higher, the flames licking up to chase the cold from the corners. The young woman lay wrapped in his old wool blanket, her skin the color of worn copper, her breath shallow and uneven, a sheen of frost still clinging to her lashes. Beside her, the baby made no sound, just a fragile bundle pressed tight to her chest, small fingers curled like wilted petals. Jack's heart thudded hard against his ribs as he pulled a tin pot from the shelf, filled it with snow, and set it over the flames. The water hissed, then boiled, steam rising like ghosts into the air. He dipped a cloth into it, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against the child's skin, whispering to no one, to the fire, to the silence itself. "Don't you quit now, you hear me? Not yet." His voice cracked on the words, low and hoarse, like a man who'd begged before and hadn't been heard. Outside, the storm clawed at the shutters, but inside, time slowed to the rhythm of the fire and the faint, trembling breaths of those he'd pulled from the earth. The woman stirred, her lips parting to release a string of sounds, half Comanche, half English words too soft for him to catch until one came clear, carried on the edge of her fading strength. "Chenoa." Jack froze, his brow furrowing as he looked from her to the child. Realizing the name wasn't hers, it was the baby's. He leaned closer, brushing a strand of dirt-matted hair from her face. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "You and the boy both." Her eyes fluttered open, dark and fevered, searching his face like she was trying to place him in a world that had already slipped away. The firelight danced across her features, highlighting the smear of blood along her temple, the streaks of soil still clinging to her cheekbones. She looked young, too young for the kind of fear etched into her. "Why?" she rasped, the word barely a breath. Jack swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he reached for more water. "Because no one deserves to die buried," he said simply. The truth of it sat heavy in the room, a truth that needed no explanation. She stared at him for a heartbeat longer. Then her lashes fell, her breathing settling into the shallow rhythm of exhaustion. Jack watched her for a long time, unsure what god or ghost had driven him to that riverbank at all. He'd buried his wife 3 winters ago, under the same cold soil that had nearly taken these two, and since then he'd spoken to no one but his cattle and the wind. Saving lives wasn't something he knew how to do anymore, but leaving them to die, that was something he could never stomach. He touched the baby's forehead again, felt the faintest warmth returning beneath the skin, and for the first time in years, a spark of something that wasn't bitterness flickered inside him. Hope, maybe, or just stubbornness pretending to be hope. He sat back, staring into the fire as the woman murmured in her sleep, the baby's breath finally steadying beside her. Outside, the storm howled and the night stretched long, but in that lonely cabin on the edge of the frontier, 3 lives clung to the thin thread between death and mercy, and Jack Hollis knew that whatever came next, he was already bound to them by something stronger than fate, by the simple, fierce refusal to let another soul vanish beneath the dirt. For 3 long days, the storm raged outside like a living thing, clawing at the walls and howling through the gaps in the wood. But Jack Hollis barely heard it. His world had shrunk to the crackle of the fire, the rasp of shallow breathing, and the relentless rhythm of hope and fear trading places in his chest. The woman Chenoa, he'd decided, since that was the only name she'd given him, drifted in and out of consciousness, her fever burning hot enough to blister her lips. He fed her water by the spoonful, changed her bandages, whispered words meant to anchor her to this side of the world. The baby, small and quiet as a held breath, lay swaddled in his wife's old shawl, the one he'd kept folded in a chest for 2 years, untouched until now. Every time he looked at the child's face, the ache that lived in him deepened an ache carved long ago, the kind that never truly faded, only settled in the bones. He remembered another winter like this one, the fever that came, without warning, the coughing, the pleading. He remembered holding his wife's hand as her skin turned cold, her belly round with the child they'd never meet. He'd buried them both beneath the old cedar on the ridge and sworn he'd never let himself care again. But here he was, tending strangers as if his own soul depended on it, whispering the same words he'd whispered to ghosts. Hold on. Just hold on. By the 3rd day, the fire had burned low and the storm had finally spent itself. The world outside the cabin was quiet again, blank and bright beneath a new layer of snow. Jack sat slumped in the chair near the hearth, eyes heavy, when a sound stirred him, a small, choked breath that wasn't the baby's. He looked over and saw her eyes open, unfocused at first, then sharp with sudden panic. She tried to sit up, but the movement sent a shiver through her whole body. Easy, he said, rising quickly, his voice gentler than he meant it to be. You're safe, here. But she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. They'll come back. Jack frowned. Who? Her eyes darted toward the door, wild and haunted. The men who buried us, she said. If they find us, they'll finish it. Her words hung in the air like frost, and Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He crouched beside her, his gaze steady. You don't need to worry about them now. They won't get this far. But even as he said it, a part of him knew he couldn't promise that. He'd seen too much of what hatred could drive men to do, and the frontier didn't forgive mercy easily. She clutched the baby tighter to her chest, her knuckles white, whispering something in her language, a prayer, maybe, or a curse. The fire threw light across her face, and for the first time Jack saw how young she truly was, barely more than a girl, carrying the weight of something far greater than fear. They wanted the child, she murmured. Said, he didn't deserve to live with my blood in him. Said they were cleansing what didn't belong. Her voice cracked, and the words struck Jack like a fist to the gut. He stared into the fire, jaw tight, memories flooding of preachers spitting words about purity, of graves dug for those born wrong in a land that claimed to be holy. He looked at her then, at the child sleeping against her, and said quietly, Then they'll have to go through me first. She met his eyes, tears glinting in the firelight, and for a heartbeat, the terror in her face softened into something else, trust, fragile and fleeting but real. Outside, the wind carried the scent of thawing earth, and though winter still ruled the land, something in the air had shifted. Jack knew the fight wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. But he also knew one thing for certain: he'd already lost too much to the cold, and this time, he wasn't about to let death have its way. The morning broke cold and bright, sunlight spilling across the snow like fire over glass. And for the first time in days, the wind had quieted enough for Jack to hear the world breathe again. The land stretched white and endless beyond his porch, every drift untouched until he saw the tracks. They cut across the ridge above the river, deep and deliberate, too heavy for deer, too straight for wanderers. Boot tracks. Fresh. His breath fogged in the air as he knelt to study them, fingers brushing the edges of the impressions. Whoever had made them had circled his property once, then turned back toward the hills. Watching. Testing. His gut tightened. The kind of unease that came from knowing the storm outside wasn't the one to fear. Jack stood slowly, eyes sweeping the horizon, the rifle already heavy in his hands before he realized he'd reached for it. The silence out there was wrong, not peaceful, not empty, just waiting. He followed the tracks for 100 yards before they vanished into the brush, then turned back toward the cabin, every step louder than it should have been. By the time he reached the porch, his pulse had settled into something steady, something that used to mean survival. Inside, the fire still burned, the smell of broth mixing with wood smoke. Chenoa sat near the hearth, her long dark hair loose over her shoulders, the baby asleep in her arms. She looked up the moment he entered, and whatever calm she'd found vanished at the sight of his face. You saw them. She said it wasn't a question. Jack set the rifle down long enough to shrug off his coat. Boot prints by the ridge, he said. Didn't come close, but they're watching. Her grip on the baby tightened, her voice trembling. You cannot fight them, Jack. You cannot win against hate. He stopped, his back to her, the weight of her words hanging like smoke between them. Then he turned, eyes dark beneath the shadow of his hat. Ma'am, he said, his voice low and even. I've been fightin' hate my whole life. Ain't lost yet. The conviction in his tone startled her as much as it did him, and for a heartbeat neither spoke. The fire popped, and the baby stirred, letting out a small, fragile sound, a soft coo that broke the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Jack's gaze shifted toward the sound, and his expression softened in a way that seemed to pain him. You keep that little one close, he murmured, reaching for the kettle. If they're comin', they'll come soon. Men like that don't wait long. Chenoa rose unsteadily, still weak but stronger than before. She crossed the room to him, her voice barely more than a whisper. You would die for a woman you do not know. He met her eyes, the scar along his jaw catching the firelight. I buried someone once, he said, his words slow, deliberate. Didn't lift a hand to stop it, won't make that mistake twice. She looked at him for a long moment, the depth of his loss reflected in the lines around his eyes. You think your gun will keep them from us? She asked. No, he said simply, but it'll make 'em remember the cost. The baby whimpered again, and Jack turned toward the sound, his rough features softening. Easy now, little fella, he murmured, the same words he'd once spoken to a child who never took a breath. Chenoa watched him, her fear tempered by something else, understanding, maybe even faith. Outside, the wind stirred again, carrying the faint echo of hoofbeats too distant to be sure. Jack went to the door, checking the latch, then the rifle. Get some rest, he said, not turning back. If they're near, we'll know soon enough. The firelight caught his silhouette against the window, broad and unyielding, a man carved from loss and duty. And as the cabin settled into uneasy silence, Chenoa realized what kind of man fate had led her to the kind who stood between the living and the grave, not because he wanted to, but because someone had to. The storm came again with nightfall, rolling low and heavy over the plains, thunder echoing through the canyons like the slow beat of war drums. Jack had sealed the shutters, fed the fire high, and sat sharpening his knife more for the comfort of the sound than the need of the blade. Chenoa lay nearby, the baby sleeping against her chest, the orange glow of the hearth painting her face in shifting shadows. For a long time neither spoke. The only voices were the wind's hollow moan and the fire's soft hiss, but the weight of silence had grown too heavy to bear. Finally, her voice rose, quiet and steady, threaded with pain that didn't need words to make itself known. You asked me who they were, she began, eyes fixed on the flames. The men who buried us. Jack stilled his hands, the whetstone pausing mid-stroke. She didn't wait for his answer. They came at dawn, she said, riding in under white flags, saying they were sent by the fort to hunt, raiders Comanche who'd taken cattle and burned a ranch house. But they weren't soldiers. They were bounty men, hired killers. My husband tried to speak with them. They shot him before he finished his first word. Her voice wavered only slightly, but the firelight caught the glint of tears that refused to fall. They took what they wanted, food, horses, gold, the dead for proof of their pay. I ran with my son, hid in the dry riverbed, thought the storm would cover my tracks. But they found me. Jack's hand tightened around the knife handle. He stared at the blade's edge, at the reflection of fire on steel, because he couldn't bear to look at her. I told them nothing, she continued, her gaze distant, her voice flattening into something beyond grief. They asked where my people went, where the others hid. When I said I did not know, they laughed, said the dirt would teach me how to remember. Then they dug the hole. The wind roared against the cabin, drowning her for a heartbeat, and Jack wished it would drown her words too. I prayed the earth would take me first, she whispered, before the cold or the fear. But then I felt him move the baby, pressing against me like he was fighting too. I could not die while he still breathed. She drew the blanket tighter around the child, her eyes finally lifting to Jack's. You ask why I am afraid. I am afraid because men like that never stop. They bury what they fear. They burn what they cannot bury. Her words hung heavy in the room, and Jack felt them settle deep, scraping against something raw inside him. He wanted to speak, to tell her she was safe now, but the lie stuck in his throat, because as she spoke, he'd seen faces flicker through his mind, ranchers from the valley, men he'd traded cattle with, drank whiskey beside, men who'd boasted of keeping order west of the Red River. He'd known the type all his life, the ones who called their cruelty justice, who branded mercy as weakness. And now, he realized with a hollow dread, some of those same men might have been the ones who'd buried her. His neighbors, his friends. The fire popped, and he flinched, guilt burning hotter than the flames. Chenoa must have seen the shift in his face, because her voice softened, as if she understood more than he'd said. "You know them," she murmured. He didn't answer, just stared into the fire until the colors blurred. "I know men like them," he said finally, his voice rough. "And I know they don't leave their work unfinished." The storm hammered harder, rattling the windows like fists on a coffin lid. Jack rose, crossed to the door, and checked the latch for the third time that hour. When he turned back, Chenoa's eyes were still on him, calm but unyielding. "You cannot carry their sins," she said. "Only choose what you do with them." He nodded once, though the truth of it cut deep. Outside, the thunder rolled closer, and the wind screamed through the canyon like the ghosts of the dead she'd left behind. Inside, Jack Hollis sat in the glow of the fire, a rifle across his knees, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the line between salvation and vengeance was already beginning to blur, and by dawn, the soil might claim more than just memory. The morning broke red, the kind of dawn that promised no peace, just blood and smoke. Jack Hollis woke to the sound of gunfire, sharp cracks slicing through the half-light, and before his mind could catch up, his body was already moving. He grabbed the rifle from its place by the door, threw on his coat, and burst into the yard. The cold hit him like a slap, but the sight that met him burned hotter than any fire could. His barn, his father's old barn, was a tower of flame, roaring against the pale sky, black smoke twisting up like a signal to the devil himself. Cattle bawled in panic, breaking through the corral, and the air stank of burning hay and oil. Through the haze, 3 riders galloped away toward the river, their shapes ghost-like in the fog, the morning light catching the glint of rifles across their backs. Jack raised his gun, steadying the barrel against a fence post, and fired. The first shot missed, the second caught one of the bastards high in the shoulder, the impact jerking him sideways in the saddle. The man clung on, barely, and then they vanished into the mist, leaving only hoofprints and ruin behind. Jack lowered the rifle, breath coming hard, his jaw set tight enough to crack teeth. The fire roared behind him, devouring the barn that had stood since before he was born. For a long moment, all he could do was stare, watching years of work and memory collapse into ash. Then he heard her voice behind him, trembling, urgent. "Jack." He turned. Chenoa stood in the doorway of the cabin, her shawl pulled tight, the baby clutched to her chest. Her eyes dark, wide, still rimmed with sleep, found the smoke rising behind him, and the color drained from her face. "They know," she whispered. "They know you helped me." He didn't answer at first, just watched the last of the barn roof cave in with a roar that shook the ground. Embers lifted into the sky, carried off by the wind, glowing like dying stars. "Then I guess," he said, finally, his voice low and steady, "they know what side I'm on now." The words came out like a verdict, one he'd known was coming since the day he pulled her from the dirt. He turned toward the barn, grabbed a shovel, and started hauling water from the trough, dousing what he could before the fire spread to the cabin. Chenoa came to his side, trying to help despite the child in her arms, but he stopped her with a look. "Get inside," he said. "Keep him warm. This ain't over." She hesitated, torn between fear and pride. But when she saw the look in his eyes, flat, cold, determined, she obeyed. The flames hissed as the water hit, steam rising around him like ghosts, and Jack worked until his arms burned and the fire finally began to die. When it was done, the barn was nothing but charred ribs against the sky, the smell of ruin hanging heavy in the air. He stood there a long time, his breath misting in the dawn. the rifle still in his hands, though there was no one left to shoot. He could feel the land watching him, the silence between the wind gusts thick with promise and warning both. Inside, the baby began to cry, that thin wail cutting through the smoke, a sound that somehow reminded him of why he hadn't walked away when he'd had the chance. He turned back toward the cabin, the edges of his coat singed, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes clear and fierce as tempered steel. "They wanted to make this a war," he muttered under his breath. "Guess I'll give 'em one." The wind shifted, carrying the last of the smoke down the valley like a message, and somewhere out there, he knew the men who'd started this were watching, waiting to see if the rancher would break. But Jack Hollis wasn't built for breaking. He was built for burying the dead, and this time, he aimed to make sure it wasn't his own. The days that followed bled together in the slow rhythm of survival, the kind that left no room for fear because work filled every breath. The barn was gone, but the land still stood, and as long as there was land, Jack Hollis figured he had something worth fighting for. He rose before dawn each morning, the air sharp enough to bite, and set about mending what the fire hadn't taken: the corral, the fences, the trust he'd nearly lost in himself. Chenoa moved quietly around the homestead, her steps sure and graceful despite the cold that lingered long past winter's dew. She tended to the horse that had caught a bullet grazing the flank during the attack, humming soft, low tunes in her language as she cleaned the wound. Jack caught himself listening more than once, though he didn't understand the words. The sound itself seemed to calm the air, to remind him that peace could live even in the ruins. At first, they spoke little, two souls carrying too much loss for conversation, but in the long silences between the hammer's strikes and the cry of the wind, something began to shift. She taught him small words in Comanche, names for fire, for water, for hope, and he returned the favor by showing her how to hold a rifle steady, how to brace her shoulder, how to trust the recoil instead of fearing it. "Breathe with it," he told her, his hand guiding hers along the barrel. "If you fight the kick, it'll bite back." She tried, missed, then smiled when the next shot struck true, the echo rolling across the valley like thunder. That smile stayed with him long after, carved somewhere deep beneath the armor he'd worn since the day his world turned cold. Evenings came slow, bringing the faint smell of rain on thawing earth, and they would sit by the fire once the baby was asleep, each lost in thought yet somehow less alone for it. She mended his coat one night, stitching over a rip from years before, and when he asked why she bothered, she said simply, "Because you didn't stop when I was buried." The words sat heavy in his chest, the kind that didn't need answering. On the fourth evening, the baby laughed, a sharp, bright sound that broke through the steady crackle of the fire. It startled them both. Chenoa looked down at her son in disbelief, then at Jack, her face lighting in a way he hadn't seen before. Jack blinked, then smiled awkwardly at first, like a man remembering how. The laugh came again, soft and bubbling, and for a heartbeat, the weight of grief and smoke and blood lifted from the room. He found himself laughing, too quiet, low, but real, and when Chenoa joined him, it filled the cabin in a way no fire ever could. It wasn't just sound, it was life, raw and new, threading through the cracks of everything broken. Jack felt something loosen in him then, something that had been clenched tight for years, a wound he hadn't realized was still bleeding, finally beginning to close. He watched the baby's small hands reach for the firelight, saw the reflection of it dance in Chenoa's eyes, and thought, against all sense, that maybe the world hadn't finished with him yet. Outside, the snow melted in slow rivulets down the ridge, feeding the river that had nearly been their grave. The land breathed again, and so did he. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack Hollis didn't feel like a man waiting to die. He felt like someone learning, however clumsily, how to live again. The sound of hooves carried through the thawing valley long before the man appeared, that slow, deliberate rhythm that spoke of duty more than haste. Jack was out by the corral, mending a post splintered by winter wind, when he saw the rider crest the ridge, a broad-shouldered figure in a weathered duster, badge glinting dull beneath the weak morning Sunday. Sheriff Dugan. Jack set his hammer down but didn't move, just watched as the lawman rode in, boots hitting the ground with a thud that seemed to echo through the cold, damp air. "Heard you been keeping company," Dugan said, his tone even but his eyes sharp. "Whole town's talking, Jack. Say you're harboring one of them Comanche raiders. The word hung in the air like smoke from a burned-out barn. Jack straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his coat, his voice flat. That woman's no raider. Dugan adjusted his hat, gaze drifting toward the cabin where faint curls of chimney smoke rose into the pale sky. Maybe not. But you know how talk runs in Bitter Hollow. The settlers are scared. They see one of hers. They start thinking there's more out there. Thinking maybe another raid's coming. Jack's jaw tightened. Scared men'll believe anything that makes their fear look righteous. The sheriff sighed, a sound caught between weariness and warning. You always did have a way of making things harder than they needed to be. Look, Jack, I don't want trouble, but the ranchers are restless. They're saying she's the one from the Valley raid last fall, the one where old man Driscoll's boy got himself killed. Jack's eyes darkened, the name hitting harder than the words themselves. Driscoll, one of the neighbors whose cattle grazed near his own. One of the men who'd likely sent those bounty riders into the hills. And what are they saying they'll do? He asked quietly. Dugan met his gaze, the lines in his face deepening. They aim to ride out. Here come nightfall. Say they're bringing justice. Jack barked a short, humorless laugh. Justice, huh? That what they called it when they buried a woman alive with her baby? The sheriff's shoulders sagged slightly. I didn't come to argue what's right, Jack. I came to give you a chance to make it out clean. Send her away. Say she moved on. Let the wind take the rest. Jack shook his head once, slow but firm. That woman's done nothing but survive, he said. And I'll be damned if I let men like them decide she ain't got the right. For a moment neither man spoke, only the wind shifting through the brittle grass between them. Dugan finally looked away, toward the horizon where gray clouds gathered like smoke. You got a good heart, Jack, but good hearts don't last long out here. You stand in their way. They'll bury you beside her. Jack's hand drifted to the rifle propped against the fence, fingers brushing the worn wood. Then let 'em try, he said quietly, his tone as cold and certain as the steel beneath his grip. Dugan watched him for a long time, then swung back into the saddle, his voice low. You always did pick the losing side. Jack met his gaze. Not this time. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded once, spurred his horse and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the wind. Jack stood there long after he was gone, staring out toward the horizon where night would soon fall. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open, and Chenoa's voice drifted through the cold. They're coming, aren't they? He turned, the rifle in his hand now, steady and sure. Ain't the first time men came knocking with fire, he said. Difference is this time, they'll find someone waitin'. The sun sank over the ridge in a blaze of copper and blood, its dying light spilling across the valley like a warning. Jack felt the weight of it before he heard the horses, the heavy thud of hooves, the creak of saddle leather, the low murmur of men trying to work up the courage to do something ugly. He'd been ready since morning, rifle loaded, extra shells lined across the table beside the lantern. Chenoa had packed the baby in a cradle behind the hearth, wrapped in blankets, though the child's cries still carried through the cabin like a heartbeat that refused to quit. When the riders appeared, 5 of them in all, their torches burned bright against the dusk, the flames snapping like the mouths of dogs. Hollis, one of them shouted, his voice slurred by whiskey and hate. Ain't no woman worth dying over. Send her out and we'll leave what's left of you standing. Jack didn't answer. He watched them fan out in a semicircle, the glow of the torches throwing monstrous shadows against the cabin walls. You think I won't burn you out? The man yelled again. She's a killer. A savage. Jack raised his rifle, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed. The shot cracked like lightning, shattering the quiet and dropping the loudest of the bunch flat in the snow. Chaos followed gunfire, shouting, the acrid smell of powder filling the night. The torches hit the ground, some dying, others rolling close enough to set the grass smoking. Jack ducked beneath the window, firing again, feeling splinters slice across his knuckles as bullets tore through the walls. Chenoa crouched near the door, her face pale but steady, the rifle he'd taught her to use gripped tight in her hands. Stay low, he shouted, but she didn't move. Her eyes locked on the door as if she could already see what waited beyond it. The baby's wails rose higher, wild and terrified, each cry a knife through the noise. Jack's heart pounded. Cover the back. He called, and she nodded, slipping behind the table as another volley shattered the front window. One of the men whooped outside, closing in, and Jack fired again, the recoil jolting his shoulder. A moment later, the door splintered inward, the hinges shrieking as a boot kicked through. The man who stepped in reeked of sweat and smoke, his eyes bright with that particular kind of madness men wore when they thought themselves righteous. He barely had time to raise his gun before the cabin exploded with sound. Chenoa's rifle thundered once, the shot echoing off the walls, and the man dropped where he stood, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. The room fell still except for the baby's cries and the slow, ragged breathing of two people who had nothing left to lose. Smoke curled through the broken door, the scent of fire creeping in, but Jack didn't move. He looked at her, this woman he'd dug from the dirt, and saw her hands shaking around the rifle, her eyes wide and wet but fierce. "No more graves," she said, her voice trembling, but the words rang with something that felt like truth, like finality. Outside, the remaining men faltered. Jack saw their shadows waver, heard their muttered curses as they fired blindly into the dark. He shot twice more, each round answering theirs, until one screamed and the others turned tail, galloping into the night, their torches dying one by one in the cold wind. Silence settled, deep and heavy, broken only by the baby's sobs and the hiss of the dying fire. Jack lowered his rifle slowly, his breath coming hard, and crossed to where Chenoa stood frozen, her face pale in the flickering light. He placed a hand on the rifle, easing it from her grip, his voice low. "It's over." She blinked, as if the word itself were foreign, then looked down at the man on the floor, her jaw trembling but her eyes dry. "No," she said softly. "It's just beginning." Outside, the wind swept through the valley, carrying away the smoke, the echoes, the ghosts. Inside, the small cabin stood battered but unbroken, a cradle of warmth in a land that had forgotten mercy. And as the night closed in, Jack Hollis knew that whatever came next, the world would remember this place not for the fire that tried to consume it, but for the fire that refused to die. The dawn crept over Bitter Hollow like a ghost, unsure it was welcome, the first light gray and thin as smoke curling through the valley. Jack stood on the porch with his rifle slung low, eyes fixed on the horizon, the smell of gunpowder and ash still heavy in the air. The snow around the cabin was trampled and red in places where the firelight hadn't quite reached, and beyond the ridge, the crows were already circling. Inside, Chenoa fed the baby in silence, her movements steady but her face distant, hollowed by the weight of what they'd done to stay alive. The quiet didn't last. By mid-morning, the sound of hooves rose again, this time slower, heavier, measured. Jack turned to see Sheriff Dugan riding in at the head of a small group of townsfolk, ranchers, drifters, even a preacher or two, their faces drawn tight with a mix of curiosity and fear. The sheriff dismounted without a word, his boots sinking into the thawing mud as his eyes swept over the scene, the burned-out the frellet, grass, the bullet-pocked walls, the bodies half covered with a tarp near the corral. He crouched beside them, lifting one corner to reveal a face he recognized, then let it fall again with a sigh that sounded almost like resignation. "Looks like justice found him before I did," he said, straightening up. Jack didn't move, didn't lower his guard. "Justice don't need a badge," he said quietly. Dugan's eyes flicked to Chenoa, standing now in the doorway with the baby in her arms, her dark hair braided back, her gaze calm but defiant. The murmurs started then low, bitter sounds from the men behind him. "Ain't right," one muttered. "Shelterin' her kind after what happened to Driscoll's boy." Another spat in the dirt. "Should have let the fire take her too." Dugan raised a hand for silence, but Jack was already stepping forward. He moved slow, deliberate, his boots crunching over frost and ash. When he spoke, his voice carried not loud, but firm, enough to cut through every whisper like the crack of a whip. "Any man who'd bury a woman and child in the dirt ain't worth callin' human," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy as the smoke that still lingered. "You don't like that truth. You can leave my land." The silence that followed was the kind that stretched forever. The townsfolk shifted, eyes darting between the sheriff and the rancher, between the woman on the porch and the corpses cooling at the fence line. None of them stepped forward. None of them spoke. The wind stirred the ashes at Jack's feet, carrying the faint scent of gunpowder and pine. And in that moment, the line was drawn not between white and Comanche, not between law and outlaw, but between those who could still see decency for what it was and those who'd buried theirs long ago. Dugan finally broke the silence, his voice low but clear. "Reckon this valley's seen enough graves," he said. He glanced at Chenoa, then back to Jack. "Ain't nobody gonna write this up. Call it self-defense. Call it providence. I don't much care what name you give it. Just make sure no one else has reason to ride this way." Jack nodded once, the rifle still resting in his hands but his stance easing, just barely. The sheriff tipped his hat, turned to his horse, and mounted. The others followed, one by one, muttering into the cold, their courage dissolving now that daylight had stripped their hate of its shadow. When the last hoofbeat faded down the trail, Jack turned toward the cabin. Chenoa met his eyes, her face unreadable, the child pressed close against her chest. "It's over?" she asked softly. Jack looked past her, to the wreckage of his land, the blood in the snow, the horizon already swallowing the dead. "No," he said. "It's just quieter now." The wind picked up, carrying the faint cry of an infant and the rustle of thawing branches. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the blackened earth, and though the world had not forgiven, it had, for the moment, decided to let them live. Spring came slow that year, shy and uncertain, as if the earth itself didn't quite believe it deserved to breathe again. The snow melted first from the high ridges, spilling down in silver threads that fed the river, then from the meadows, revealing grass pale and new beneath the wreckage of winter. Jack Hollis rose each morning to the sound of water dripping from the eaves, the air thick with the smell of thawing earth and pine smoke. The land that had burned now stirred with life again. Chenoa moved quietly around the porch, planting herbs in the softening soil, sage, sweetgrass, wild mint she'd found along the creek. She sang while she worked, low and steady, a song that seemed to belong more to the wind than to her voice. The baby, no longer the frail shadow he'd been, gurgled on a blanket nearby, sunlight catching the fine black hair on his head. Jack watched them from the fence line, one hand resting on the wood, the other offered to the child, who reached out and gripped his finger with fierce determination. The smallness of that hand, the warmth of it, hit him harder than any bullet ever could. He'd spent years thinking the earth only took it had taken his wife, his child, his peace, but now he saw how it could give too, how it could dig deep and return what was lost, just not in the way a man expected. When Chenoa straightened, brushing dirt from her palms, he caught her smiling, soft, weary, but real. That smile was the kind of thing that could root itself in a man's bones. Days passed in the quiet rhythm of healing. The fences were mended, the cattle gathered again, the scars on the land fading like the ones on their hearts. But one morning, a sound carried through the plains that made Chenoa lift her head, a drumbeat, faint but growing, accompanied by the soft thunder of hooves. Jack reached for his rifle, but she caught his wrist gently, shaking her head. "No," she said, eyes bright with something between joy and disbelief. "They've come." From the edge of the horizon, a line of riders appeared, Comanche, proud and painted, sunlight gleaming on their hair and weapons. At their front rode a man with Chenoa's eyes and the same strong lines in his face. Her brother. They dismounted near the cabin, speaking in the rolling rhythm of their tongue, their voices rising with laughter and tears. Chenoa placed the baby in her brother's arms, and for the first time since the riverbank, she wept openly, not from fear, but from homecoming. Jack stood back, hat in hand, feeling both part of it and apart from it all at once. After a while, Chenoa turned to him. "They will ride north," she said softly, "to the high country, where the land is still ours." She stepped closer, the breeze tugging at her braid. "You can come with us, if you wish. It will be safer." Jack looked out over the valley, the half-rebuilt barn, the graves beneath the cedar, the place where fire and blood had soaked the soil, but mercy had somehow taken root. His voice came low, rough with something deeper than weariness. "I ain't got kin left in this world," he said, "'cept maybe the ones fate buried and gave back." For a moment, she just looked at him, the wind stirring between them. Then her face softened, and she said through tears, "Then ride with us. Natu, our brother." The word struck him still. He hadn't been called brother in a long, long time. He glanced once more at the land that had been both his curse and his salvation, then swung into the saddle beside her. The riders turned toward the open plains, their horses moving as one, hooves drumming a rhythm older than fences or names. The baby laughed a clear, bright sound that carried over the hills, and Chenoa laughed too, her joy rising to meet the wind. Jack found himself smiling, the first true smile in years, as they rode into the wide sunlit country, leaving behind smoke, sorrow, and ghosts that finally had the grace to rest. And as the plains opened before them, endless and golden, Jack Hollis felt the strange, steady peace of a man reborn not by miracle, but by mercy.